On a night when fate mixed with danger, an arrogant police officer dared to challenge none other than Jason Statham. But he never imagined that by facing the man, he would awaken hidden forces capable of transforming his life forever. The scream pierced São Paulo's rainy night like a lightning bolt. Jason couldn't breathe, his trembling hands clutching his cell phone while his eyes were fixed on Statham's motionless body, sprawled on the wet asphalt. Blood blended with the rainwater, forming small scarlet rivers that snaked across the pavement toward the street corner's storm drain on Avenida Paulista. "An ambulance, please," she finally managed to say to the 192 operator, her voice almost unrecognizable. He isn't moving." A crowd was already beginning to form. Onlookers sheltered under colorful umbrellas, drivers stopped their cars. In the growing traffic jam, all drawn to the tragedy unfolding under the flashing lights of traffic signals and the neon of commercial buildings. Suddenly, a man in a white coat emerged from among the people, kneeling beside Douglas. Nina recognized him immediately. "The policeman," she murmured in disbelief. The doctor did not reply. His experienced fingers pressed against Douglas's neck in search of a pulse, while his eyes, burdened with deep dark circles, examined the body with an almost supernatural concentration. "He's still alive," announced the doctor, his voice surprisingly calm amid the chaos. "But not for much longer if we don't act now." Nina felt the world spin. How had they come to this point? What was Dr. Mendez doing there, right on that corner on that very night? Time seemed to slow as she watched the doctor's hands work precisely on Douglas's body. The same man that 6 months earlier Nina had sworn to destroy. The same man whose name she spat like venom in her conversations with Douglas. The same man now desperately fighting to save the life of her beloved. "Step back. Give him space, Doctor." Mendez's authoritative voice echoed in the night as he carried out the resuscitation maneuvers. The rain continued relentlessly, drenching everyone. Car headlights illuminated the scene like makeshift spotlights, and Nina remained paralyzed, holding the now silent cell phone against her chest as the memories of the past months flashed back in vivid, painful bursts. Like a sinister puzzle, the pieces were finally starting to fall into place. 6 months earlier, Nina Weber was just another talented 32-year-old architect working on an ambitious project to revitalize an abandoned area in the eastern zone of São Paulo. Her vibrant red hair and tattooed slender wrists were her trademarks in professional circles, but it was her almost fierce determination that truly defined her. Douglas Santos, 35, had been her partner for 4 years. An award-winning photojournalist, and perpetually restless, he complemented Nina's intensity with an almost zen calm, a result of years spent documenting both beauty and horror around the world. His dark skin contrasted with his light eyes, a heritage from a Portuguese grandmother, and his easy smile masked a deep fear, the fear of failing those he loved, just as his father had failed his family. The couple's life changed drastically one April afternoon when Douglas fainted during a photo exhibition. The diagnosis hit them hard: acute myeloid leukemia. Nina, who always planned everything meticulously, suddenly found herself in uncharted territory, where her architectural drawings and detailed blueprints were rendered useless. "There are several treatment protocols," explained Dr. Ricardo Mendez, 52, hematologist at Hospital São Lucas, as he adjusted the thin-rimmed glasses on his sharp nose. His impeccably clean lab coat and upright posture conveyed a confidence that momentarily calmed the couple. "We'll begin with intensive chemotherapy immediately." What Nina did not know was that Dr. Mendez carried his own burden. After losing his wife to cancer 5 years earlier, he had developed a defense mechanism that made him clinically efficient but emotionally distant. His greatest fear was to connect again with patients and their families, only to see them go. While Douglas faced his first cycle of chemotherapy, Nina met the new police chief Campos in the hospital corridor. The 40-year-old history teacher, with eyes that always seemed to be on the verge of tears and a notebook always at hand, was there for her husband, also an oncology patient. "You need to prepare to fight not only against the disease but against the system," Marcella warned Nina over a coffee in the hospital cafeteria. Dr. Mendez is technically brilliant, but he doesn't go beyond the basic protocol. Marcela explained that there was an experimental treatment at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro that was showing promising results in cases like Douglas's. But it was expensive, and the public health system didn't cover it. Her husband had been rejected from the program. Dr. Mendez wouldn't even discuss the possibility, Marcela said bitterly. He said it was giving false hope, but I know he could have helped us with a recommendation. 2. Weeks later, Marcela's husband passed away. Nina hugged her at the funeral, feeling a chill of fear run down her spine. That same night, she found Douglas examining test results with a somber expression. "It's not working as they expected," he confessed, "but Mendez says I just need to endure one more cycle." For Nina, it was the tipping point. Armed. With Marcela's information, she tirelessly researched the experimental treatment in Rio. She printed studies, success stories, statistics. She prepared as she did for defending her most ambitious architectural projects. At the next consultation, Nina unloaded all that information on Dr. Mendez. The doctor listened in silence, his face an impenetrable mask. "This treatment is not appropriate for Douglas's case," he finally said, without looking up from the tests. "We will continue with the established protocol. Or is the problem that you refuse to admit there's something beyond your precious protocol?" Nina shot back, unable to contain her frustration. "Something you can't control? Something that could give us real hope?" Dr. Mendez's gaze towards Nina was icy. "Real hope doesn't come from empty promises, Miss Weber. It comes from proven treatments." From that day on, the relationship between Nina and the doctor completely deteriorated. Douglas, weakened by chemotherapy, found himself torn between trust in the doctor and his love for Nina. The architect, for her part, became increasingly obsessed with the experimental treatment. Against Dr. Mendez's recommendations, Nina and Douglas traveled to Rio for a consultation. The doctor responsible for the study was enthusiastic about Douglas's case, but he was honest. "We need a formal recommendation from his attending physician, and the treatment itself will cost about $450,000, which the study doesn't fully cover." Determined, Nina returned to São Paulo. She took out a loan using her apartment as collateral, spoke with Douglas's family, and together they managed to gather nearly the full amount. Only Dr. Mendez's recommendation was missing. "I can't recommend a treatment I consider unsuitable for your specific case," the doctor remained adamant. "It would be unethical." That's when Nina crossed a line. Using her contacts, she discovered that Dr. Mendez's son, the officer, a 23-year-old young man, was a newly graduated architect seeking employment. She offered him a position at her firm in exchange for a more open conversation with the doctor about Douglas's case. Dr. Mendez received the proposal as a direct affront. "You're trying to bribe me to put your partner's life at risk," he accused furiously. "I'm ethically obliged to report this to the hospital committee." That night, as a storm-battered São Paulo, Douglas suddenly deteriorated and had to be rushed to the hospital. Nina, devastated by fear and guilt, watched as Dr. Mendez worked tirelessly to stabilize him, wondering if her intervention had in some way compromised her beloved's treatment. 3 months passed since the emergency hospitalization. Douglas had recovered enough to return home, but his body was visibly more fragile. His hair, once styled in shoulder-length dreads, was now only a memory. His eyes, however, still held that stubborn sparkle that Nina adored. "I need to start taking photos again," Douglas announced on a Sunday morning as he listlessly stirred the breakfast Nina had prepared. "But Mendez said you need to avoid exposure." "I don't care what Mendez said," Douglas cut in firmly, a resolve Nina hadn't seen in him for a long time. "I can't just exist, Nina. I need to live." That afternoon, at his insistence, they walked to the nearest park. Douglas carried his old analog camera, refusing to use any lighter digital equipment. "The feeling isn't the same," he explained, manually adjusting the focus as he photographed a group of children playing soccer. Nina watched, her heart heavy, as he frequently had to stop to rest. But she also noticed how his eyes lit up every time he framed a new shot. It was as if the camera were an extension of him, pumping energy into his weakened body. On the way back, they stopped at a pharmacy to buy the medications prescribed by Dr. Mendez. The pharmacist recognized Nina. Dr. Mendez's son was here earlier today, she commented casually while separating the medicines. He mentioned you. Nina froze. Gabriel? What did he say? He mentioned that he's working at the architect's office of the redhead who's taking care of the boyfriend with leukemia. It must be you, right? He said he's loving the work and that you're very lucky. Nina didn't reply, feeling that familiar wave of guilt. She had indeed hired Gabriel a month after that terrible night in the emergency room, but not as part of a sordid negotiation. The young architect had genuine talent, and she needed help with the projects she had neglected during Douglas's illness. At home, while Douglas slept, Nina mentally reviewed the past few months. Her relationship with Dr. Mendez remained frosty, limited to what was strictly necessary during consultations. She had given up on the experimental treatment, partly because Douglas no longer had the physical strength to undergo it, and partly because the preliminary results were not as promising as she had hoped. Marcella reappeared in her life, now as a volunteer in the support group for relatives of oncology patients that Nina had started attending. Her bitterness had given way to a surprising serenity. Do you know why Dr. Mendez is so strict with the protocols? Marcella asked one evening after a group meeting. He lost his wife to the same disease that Douglas has. She participated in an experimental treatment that went wrong. The revelation hit Nina like a punch. Suddenly, the doctor's coldness took on new context. It wasn't arrogance or a lack of empathy, it was fear. The same fear that consumed Nina every night as she watched Douglas sleep, terrified that every breath might be his last. In a particularly tense consultation, when the new tests showed a worsening of his condition, Nina finally confronted the elephant in the room. I know about your wife, she said, as Dr. Mendez examined the results, and I understand why you fear experimental treatments so much. The doctor looked up, visibly shaken. For a moment, Nina glimpsed the pain behind the professional facade. Then you should understand why I refuse to offer false hope, he replied, regaining his composure, especially when the emotional cost is so high. And what if it isn't false hope? Nina insisted. What if it's our only hope? The conversation was interrupted when Douglas entered the room, paler than usual. 3 days later, he suffered a severe hemorrhage and was rushed back to the ICU. It was during this new hospitalization that Nina discovered, through Gabriel, that Dr. Mendez spent his nights researching cases similar to Douglas's, consulting international colleagues, and searching for alternatives within safe protocols. The doctor had identified a new treatment, recently approved in Europe, that might help. He never mentioned this during our consultations, Nina observed, confused. My father doesn't promise anything he can't deliver, Gabriel explained, and he still hasn't secured approval to import the medication. Determined to help, Nina rallied her architect friends. In 1 week, she organized a charity auction of architectural projects to raise funds. To her surprise, Dr. Mendez appeared at the event. I'm not here to approve or disapprove of your actions, he said, visibly uncomfortable in the artistic environment. But I admire your persistence. It was the first truce in months of Cold War. The following week, the doctor presented a proposal, an alternative protocol combining conventional treatment with controlled doses of the European medication. It wasn't the experimental treatment from Rio, but it was a significant concession. Douglas, who observed everything with a mix of hope and resignation, accepted immediately. I'm tired of being a battlefield between you two, he vented. I just want to try to live the time I have left, whatever it may be. The words fell like stones on Nina. For the first time, she realized that her obsession with saving Douglas was, in a way, preventing him from fully living his days. That very night, while driving home after a hospital visit, Nina saw Dr. Mendez on the sidewalk, walking alone under a fine drizzle. Without a second thought, she stopped the car. May I give you a ride, doctor? The doctor hesitated, but the rain intensified, deciding for him. In the car, an awkward silence lingered. until Nina finally asked what had been tormenting him for months. "If it were your wife again, what would you have done differently?" Dr. Mendez stared out the window for long seconds. "I would have let her enjoy the good days more, instead of sacrificing them all for an uncertain future," he finally replied. "It's what I try to allow Douglas to do now." The conversation was interrupted by an emergency call from the hospital. Douglas had disappeared from his room, and so the circle closed. Nina was now kneeling on the wet asphalt of Avenida Paulista, while Dr. Mendez struggled to stabilize Douglas until the ambulance arrived. She finally understood what had happened. Douglas, tired of the hospital routine, had decided to escape to photograph the city at night, taking advantage of a moment when the nursing staff was off guard. He was crossing the avenue when he was hit by a motorcycle. The ambulance sirens finally cut through the rainy night. Dr. Mendez continued the resuscitation maneuvers, his clothes completely soaked, his face contorted in absolute concentration. "Come on, Douglas," the doctor murmured between compressions. "Not now, not like this." The paramedics arrived, taking over the procedures. Nina and Dr. Mendez stood side by side, helplessly watching as the team worked. "I found him by chance," the doctor explained, his voice trembling. "I was going home when I saw him crossing the street with his camera. I tried to call out, but..." Nina reached out and took the doctor's hand, surprising them both. In that moment, they were no longer adversaries, but simply two people united by their love for Douglas, a love that manifested in different yet equally intense ways. Douglas was transferred to the ambulance. His vital signs were weak but present. At the hospital, he was taken directly into surgery. The wait was interminable. Marcella appeared, alerted by a nurse friend. Gabriel brought coffee for everyone. Dr. Mendez remained in the operating room for hours, refusing to leave the case to another doctor, even though it wasn't his specialty. When he finally emerged from the operating room, his dark circles had deepened, and he looked as though he had aged years in mere hours. Nina immediately stood up. "We managed to stabilize him," Dr. Mendez announced, allowing himself a slight smile. "The cranial trauma is severe, but not as catastrophic as we initially feared." "And the leukemia?" Nina asked, dreading. "The answer. Interestingly, the emergency tests showed a significant reduction in the cancerous cells," the doctor replied, almost incredulous. "It's as if his body is finally responding to the treatment." Nina broke down in tears, a mix of relief and exhaustion. Dr. Mendez, breaking all the professional protocols he had set for himself after his wife's death, sat beside her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "He's stubborn," the doctor commented. "Just like someone I know." Nina laughed through her tears. "I think the three of us are." The next morning, Douglas opened his eyes. He was confused, in pain but alive. Nina held his hand and Dr. Mendez adjusted the heart monitor. "I got some amazing photos," Douglas murmured, his voice weak but determined. "It was worth seeing." Nina and the doctor exchanged exasperated, relieved glances. "Next time you want to take nighttime photos, let's plan it properly," said Dr. Mendez, surprising everyone with this concession, with medical supervision. Douglas smiled, his eyes closing again, this time into a peaceful sleep. Nina noticed that the doctor was carefully examining the new test results. "This is remarkable," he murmured, more to himself than to Nina. "What?" "Remission. It's partial but more significant than anything we've achieved so far." Dr. Mendez removed his glasses, rubbing his tired eyes. "Maybe there's something in the combined treatment that is finally working." Or perhaps, Nina thought silently, it was something more fundamental. Douglas's will to live fully, not merely survive. To feel the rain on his face, to frame life through his lens, to take risks for the art that defined him. 6 months later, Nina organized a photographic exhibition in the lobby of Hospital São Lucas. Light Among Shadows showcased the photographs Douglas had captured on that fateful night, miraculously recovered from the memory card of the camera damaged in the accident. Douglas, still using a cane to help him move, but with his hair beginning to grow back, circulated among the visitors, explaining his compositions. His leukemia had been in remission for 3 months, and although the future remained uncertain, there was a peace that hadn't existed before. Dr. Mendez arrived discreetly, accompanied by his son Gabriel. Nina greeted them with a hug, a gesture that would have been unthinkable a year before. "The central photo is for you," Douglas said to the doctor, pointing to a framed image of Avenida Paulista under the rain. The lights reflecting off the wet asphalt, creating an urban mirror of stars. The doctor adjusted his glasses, visibly moved. "It's extraordinary. It's the exact moment before the accident," Douglas explained. "The last frame. I thought it fitting to call it Before the Awakening." The three fell silent, contemplating the image that perfectly captured the threshold between life and death, between despair and hope, between war and peace. Nina then understood that sometimes we need to reach the edge of the abyss to see clearly, that both she and Dr. Mendez had fought for Douglas's life in their own imperfect ways, driven by love and fear. And that, in the end, Douglas had found his own path between them, insisting on living every moment fully regardless of the risks. When the exhibition ended, the three walked together toward the hospital exit, not as patient, doctor and caregiver any longer, but simply as three people who had learned the hard way that life happens in imperfections and truces, in shadows as much as in light.